It was Willow, around 20 years old, a Native American girl whose eyes, though filled with a fierce, defiant spirit, also held a profound wariness and terror. They jeered at her, shoving her back and forth, treating her as if she were less than human, an object of their cruel amusement. The cowboy snarled, his voice laced with venom. "You should go back to your reservations where you belong." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground near Willow's feet, a gesture of ultimate disdain. "Stop it," Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the square's clamor with unexpected authority. The cowboys turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and irritation. The ringleader, the burly man with the walrus mustache, sneered. "Who the hell are you? You looking for trouble?" Dust and wind swirled across the unpaved streets of Deadwood, Arizona, creating a hazy veil under the sharp glare of the 1,888 sun. Weather-beaten wooden storefronts, boisterous saloons, and makeshift tents clustered together, a testament to the chaotic and deeply prejudiced heart of the untamed West. Inside the dimly lit, smoke-filled confines of the Rattlesnake Saloon, Ethan Blackwood, a former cavalry soldier with a rugged, etched face, sat alone at a scarred wooden table. His gaze was distant, burdened by a palpable sorrow and self-reproach. Years had passed since he left the army, yet the acrid smell of burning Native American villages and the echoing screams from his memories continued to haunt his nights. He had been forced to participate in those brutal acts, and the weight of that complicity was a burden he could not shed. Ethan's eyes squeezed shut, and a vivid image, like an unhealing scar, burned behind his eyelids. The Apache village, engulfed in an inferno, the hungry flames licking at every wattle and daub hut, reducing everything to ash and despair. The deafening cracks of rifle fire, the soul-rending cries of innocent villagers, women and children among them, echoed through the valley. He could feel his hands trembling, the rifle in his grip suddenly impossibly heavy. He had been caught between the brutal orders of his superiors and the desperate screams of his own conscience. The fleeting image of a young Apache child, with wide, terrified eyes, darted through the inferno. He had wanted to help, to save, but he had been powerless. That very powerlessness had become a part of him, seeping into his bones, transforming him into a living ghost trapped within himself. He sought no absolution from anyone, he only wished to flee, but even here, amidst the vast, indifferent desert, he remained a prisoner of his own soul. He whispered, the words barely audible, almost a plea to the wind. No place is far enough to forget or to be accepted. He yearned for peace, for forgiveness, but he did not know where or from whom he could ever find it. A sudden burst of shouting and derisive laughter from outside startled him from his torment. Reluctantly, he pushed himself up from the table, his eyes, once vacant, now filled with a weary alertness as he stepped out into the harsh daylight. The town square was a chaotic mess of humanity. A group of rough-hewn white cowboys, their beards unruly and clothes caked with dust, had formed a taunting circle around a young woman. It was Willow, around 20 years old, a Native American girl whose eyes, though filled with a fierce, defiant spirit, also held a profound wariness and terror. They jeered at her, shoving her back and forth, treating her as if she were less than human, an object of their cruel amusement. One of them, a burly man with a filthy walrus mustache, snatched a small leather pouch from her grasp. He grinned, scattering its contents, a handful of multicolored corn kernels, onto the dusty ground with malicious glee. "Look at this," the first cowboy sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "These savages only carry worthless things like this, eh?" He kicked at the kernels with the toe of his boot, sending them scattering further across the dirt. Willow knelt, her hands trembling as she desperately tried to gather her precious kernels, but another cowboy kicked them away again. "These wild ones have no right to be here." The second cowboy snarled, his voice laced with venom. "You should go back to your reservations where you belong." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground near Willow's feet, a gesture of ultimate disdain. Ethan stood motionless, his hands clenching into fists so tightly that his fingernails dug deep into his palms, drawing thin crescents of blood. He saw the terror in Willow's eyes, a mirror image of the fear he had witnessed and been forced to inflict upon her people during his military service. The chilling words of Captain Maxwell, his former commanding officer, about the savages echoed in his mind, merging with the crude taunts of the cowboys. His conscience screamed he had witnessed, and even participated in, such acts in the past, and the guilt now festered like an unhealing wound, throbbing with renewed intensity. He had once yearned for acceptance from this very community, to belong, but this community was now displaying the very brutality he despised. The profound regret within Ethan surged, overwhelming him. He could not stand idly by again. He had chosen silence for far too long, living a life imprisoned by his own cowardice. This gnawing self-reproach would consume him entirely if he did not act, if he did not seek to redeem his tormented soul. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, channeling every ounce of his remaining courage into each deliberate step. He walked forward, his eyes as cold as the deepest ice, sweeping over each cowboy encircling Willow. His presence, an unnerving blend of quiet determination and simmering danger, caused the jeers to falter, then die. "Stop it," Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the square's clamor with unexpected authority. The cowboys turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and irritation. The ringleader, the burly man with the walrus mustache, sneered. "Who the hell are you? You looking for trouble?" Ethan did not answer, his gaze fixed on Willow, who looked up at him, her eyes a complex mix of confusion, wariness, and a fragile flicker of hope. He saw her helplessness and her profound pain, and it struck a direct blow at the deepest recesses of his self-reproach. He realized, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that the acceptance of this community was utterly worthless compared to the preservation of his own conscience and humanity. He walked directly to Willow. Without a word, he knelt, ignoring the dust and the lingering stares. He began, slowly, deliberately, to pick up each scattered corn kernel from the dirty ground, carefully placing them back into her leather pouch. His actions were silent, yet profoundly powerful. An unspoken apology, a genuine act of respect for her and for what she represented. I am sorry." "For everything," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible to Willow alone. He was not merely apologizing for the cowboy's current actions, but for all that his people had inflicted upon hers, and for his own agonizing silence in the past. Another cowboy, emboldened by the momentary lull, moved to kick Ethan, but Ethan rose with a sudden, fluid motion, his eyes, sharp as razor blades, locked onto the approaching man, halting him mid-stride. He did not draw a weapon, but his sheer presence, the unyielding gaze of a seasoned veteran, radiated a quiet, formidable threat that none dared challenge. "She's with me," Ethan stated, looking directly at the group of cowboys, his voice resonant with unshakable conviction. The cowboys stood frozen. They had not anticipated such intervention, especially from a white man defending a Native American. One of them muttered a crude insult under his breath, but no one moved. They sensed something dangerous in Ethan, something that transcended their usual bravado. Ethan turned to Willow. She was still stunned, clutching her retrieved pouch. "Come with me." "Safe," Ethan communicated, using slow, clear gestures and minimal words. Willow looked at him, her eyes wide with a fragile flicker of hope, battling the ingrained fear of white men. She had lost everything. She had nothing left to lose, save for these precious seeds. She nodded faintly, placing her fragile fate in his hands. Ethan extended his hand, not to take hers in a romantic gesture, but to grasp her arm firmly, helping her to her feet. He led her away from the town square, amidst the curious, disdainful, and surprisingly awed stares of the lingering crowd. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that this act would mark him, forever casting him out from the community he had once yearned to join. He would become an outsider to both worlds. Yet, strangely, he felt a profound sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had made a choice. He had acted. Ethan rode his horse slowly, Willow walking silently beside him on the dusty trail leading back to his secluded ranch. He glanced at her. She still clutched the leather pouch of seeds tightly to her chest. I failed to do what was right back then, but now I have a chance to atone. This might be the only way for me to truly belong somewhere, even if it's not the community I once knew. My regret, my yearning for acceptance. Perhaps they were meant to lead me here, to this quiet path, with her. Willow glanced up at him, her eyes searching his. She gently touched her pouch of seeds, then pointed towards Ethan's chest, over his heart, and nodded. It was an unspoken promise. She understood, and she accepted. The harsh glare of the frontier sun began its slow descent, painting the endless Arizona sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Ethan rode his horse with a newfound stillness, the rhythmic thud of hooves on the dusty trail, a stark counterpoint to the chaotic echoes of the town square that still reverberated in his mind. Willow walked silently beside him, her movements fluid and graceful despite the day's ordeal. She clutched the small leather pouch of corn kernels tightly to her chest, its worn surface a familiar comfort against her palm. She didn't look at Ethan often, but when she did, her gaze was deep and discerning, absorbing every nuance of his silence. The weight of the town's judging stares, the unspoken condemnation for his defiance, still lingered in the air behind them. But Ethan felt a strange, liberating lightness. It was a burden, yes, but it was his burden, chosen deliberately, and that made all the difference. I lived too long in the shadows of what I couldn't change, bound by orders, then by guilt. I yearned for acceptance, to wash away the stain, but the community I sought it from was too quick to judge, too eager to condemn. They offered belonging only if I played by their brutal rules, but her eyes hold no judgment, only a quiet knowing. Maybe this path, outside their rules, is where real belonging lies. Not in their forgiveness, but in my own choice to finally stand for something good. My regret, it led me here, to her. Willow sensed his internal turmoil. Her own people communicated not just with words, but with the subtle shifts of the wind, the tremor of the earth. She felt the heavy silence emanating from Ethan, a man burdened by unseen battles. She glanced up, her dark eyes, ancient and wise beyond her years, meeting his. She understood his struggle, the invisible chains of his past. She gently touched her pouch of seeds, then, with a profound tenderness, reached out and placed her hand over Ethan's chest, directly above his heart. It was a silent affirmation, a promise of shared burdens and nascent trust. Ethan's breath hitched. In that touch, language and culture seemed to dissolve, replaced by the universal language of shared vulnerability and a nascent hope. The journey to Ethan's ranch passed in near silence. The familiar creak of the windmill and the scent of dry earth offered a stark comfort. He led Willow inside his small, Spartan cabin, a single room and a loft, its roof patched with old sheet metal. The flickering light from his oil lamp cast long dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, revealing a place built for solitude, but now touched by an unexpected, fragile presence. Ethan moved with quiet efficiency. He stoked the fire, the crackling flames chasing away the chill. He heated water, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. Willow watched him, her posture still, observing every deliberate movement. She remained by the window, her silhouette framed against the fading light, her gaze sweeping over the simple, functional space. There was no terror in her eyes now, only a deep-seated wariness that spoke of past traumas. "Here," Ethan muttered, his voice raspy, reaching for a clean cloth. "Clean." He knelt before her, the faint light glinting on the fresh bruises blooming on her cheek and the dried blood on her lip. His hands, rough from years of labor, moved with an unexpected tenderness as he cleaned the raw, angry rope, burns marring her wrists. He recalled the disdainful kicks, the mocking laughter in the square, and the familiar wave of shame washed over him. This wasn't merely pity. It was a desperate need to undo, to atone, to cleanse a part of himself through caring for her. He paused, giving her unspoken permission to resist, but she remained still, her quiet fortitude striking him deeply. He worked in silence, not meeting her gaze directly, though he felt her eyes on him, a silent interrogation. Her lips parted once, as if to speak, but no sound came, only a soft, ragged breath. He finished, gently wrapping her wrists in soft cloth strips. She let him, her stillness a profound testament to her trust. He draped a thick blanket over her and sat in the lone wooden chair beside the cot. He watched her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest a quiet rhythm in the stillness of the cabin. An hour passed, then two. He didn't sleep, consumed by a newfound purpose that overshadowed his own exhaustion. Sometime before dawn, she woke again, the initial wildness in her eyes replaced by a weary, cautious intelligence. She looked at him, then at her bandaged wrists, then at the deerskin pouch, which she had pulled onto her lap, her hand resting protectively on top of it. She pointed a finger at her chest. "Willow," she said, her voice rough but clear, a soft cadence Ethan found unexpectedly melodic. "Ethan," he replied, his own name sounding strange on his tongue, a name he rarely spoke aloud, a name he felt had been tainted by his past. She looked around the sparse cabin, her gaze sweeping over the rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture. Then her eyes came back to him. There was a question in them. Why? Why had he helped her? Why bring her here? He had no easy answer. He didn't fully understand it himself, but he knew it stemmed from a deep-seated need for redemption, a desperate attempt to quiet the ghosts that haunted him. She seemed to sense his turmoil. Slowly, deliberately, she loosened the drawstring on the deerskin pouch. She tipped it forward, and into the palm of her other hand rolled a small collection of corn kernels. They were unlike any he had ever seen. Some a deep midnight blue, others a fiery red, some a speckled white. They seemed to glow with an inner light in the dim cabin. She held them out for him to see, her expression one of profound, solemn reverence. Her English was broken, pieced together from a few words and expressive gestures, but her meaning was as clear as the stars outside his window. "Not gold," she said, shaking her head. She gestured towards the kernels, the heart of the people. She made a motion with her hands like something growing from the earth. Then a sweeping gesture of a great fire, her eyes clouding with pain. "Soldiers, fire village." She looked down at the kernels, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All that is left, for the new time, the new ground." Ethan stared at the kernels, and the full weight of his actions in the town square, the true consequence of his decision to intervene, settled upon him. He understood. This wasn't about a stolen horse or a runaway. It was about a future. Barlow hadn't just burned a village. He had tried to extinguish a legacy, a culture, a people. And this girl, this wounded, exhausted girl, was carrying the last spark of that future in a small leather bag. Her own life was secondary to the survival of these seeds. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a guardian, a vessel of hope. He looked up from the kernels and met her gaze. The distance between them, the rancher and the Apache, the white man and the Indian, the silent, broken soldier and the defiant guardian, vanished. In her eyes, he saw a purpose so profound it humbled him. He saw a strength he hadn't seen in anyone, least of all himself, for a very, very long time. An unspoken understanding passed between them, a vow forged in the quiet of the pre-dawn hours. It was heavier than any law, more binding than any spoken word. He wouldn't just be saving a girl from a madman, he would be protecting a legacy, and, in doing so, perhaps he could finally begin to reclaim his own. The gnawing ache of self-reproach, of being cast out by the very community he longed to belong to, began to recede, replaced by a new kind of purpose. This was a different kind of acceptance, a different kind of belonging, one forged in shared pain and mutual respect, far from the judging eyes of the town. This, he realized, was the beginning of his true atonement. 3 days had passed since Ethan brought Willow back to his cabin, days marked by a fragile peace. The initial raw wounds on Willow's wrists were healing, cared for by Ethan's surprisingly gentle hands and his limited supply of liniment. The uneasy silence between them had begun to transform, not into familiarity, but into a quiet understanding. They communicated through gestures, shared tasks, and the profound language of shared trauma. Willow, though still guarded, moved with less fear, often observing Ethan with a quiet, discerning intensity that made him feel seen in a way no one had in years. She had even shared a few more words, pointing to the corn kernels and articulating life, future, with a soft, reverent tone. Ethan, in turn, had shown her the worn cavalry compass, a relic of his past, and simply said, "Lost." Now, path, a question hanging heavy in the air. He felt a burgeoning sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that had slowly begun to fill the hollow spaces within him. But this nascent peace, he knew, was a flimsy dam against the tide of the world outside. The threat of Captain Maxwell and the town's judgment was a constant, unspoken presence, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon of his ranch. Ethan was mending a bridle on his porch, the familiar creak of the leather and the rhythmic pull of his hands, a small anchor in the rising sea of dread. Willow sat near the hearth inside, meticulously cleaning each vibrant corn kernel, preparing them as if for a sacred ceremony. The air in the cabin, though warm from the fire, felt thick, heavy with unspoken anticipation. Then Ethan saw it. A lone rider on the eastern horizon, a faint plume of dust trailing behind. Not a company of soldiers this time, just one man. But it was the one man he dreaded most. The air seemed to still, the rustle of the mesquite bushes quieting, as if the land itself held its breath. Captain Maxwell rode into the yard, not with the bluster of his previous visit, nor the triumphant swagger of a conqueror, but with the slow, deliberate menace of a snake gliding through tall grass. His horse's hooves made soft, ominous thuds on the packed earth. He dismounted, tying his horse loosely to the weathered fence post, his movements too casual, too unhurried. This was not a military action. This was personal. This was a hunt. Ethan didn't move from the porch. He continued to work the leather through his hands, the familiar, repetitive motion a small anchor in a rising sea of dread. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't acknowledge Maxwell's presence until the captain was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his imposing silhouette blocking the morning sun, casting Ethan into shadow. "You're a hard man to get rid of, Blackwood," Maxwell said, his voice deceptively calm, a low, smooth rumble. He didn't look angry. He looked amused, a dangerous glint in his cold gray eyes. But then, I always knew that. He climbed the steps without invitation, his polished boots thudding softly on the worn wood, pulling up the other wooden chair and sitting down opposite Ethan, a picture of a man paying a social call. He leaned back, crossing his legs, an air of arrogant ease about him. His eyes, devoid of warmth, scanned the cabin, lingered on the closed door behind Ethan, then settled back on Ethan himself. He didn't ask about Willow. He didn't need to. He was here to torment, to wound psychologically before delivering the fatal blow. "Been thinking about the old days," Maxwell began, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone, a mimicry of camaraderie that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He pulled a cheap cigar from his tunic, bit off the end with a sharp snap, and spat the soggy tobacco into the dust near Ethan's boots. Funny the things a man remembers out here in all this quiet. He took his time lighting the cigar, the sulphurous smell of the match briefly mingling with the scent of pine and dust, letting the silence stretch and curdle, a deliberate torture. "Remember Wolf Pass?" Maxwell said finally, the words sliding out like smoke from his lips, a poisonous whisper. The bridle slipped in Ethan's hands, falling to the porch floor with a soft thud. His heart gave a single, painful lurch, a physical ache in his chest. He had known this was coming. He had known Maxwell would use that memory, the sharpest and most poisoned arrow in his quiver. "Remember Private Miller?" Maxwell continued, his voice soft now, almost sympathetic, which made it all the more cruel, dripping with mock concern. "Skinny kid from Ohio. Cried the first time he saw a man die. You were supposed to be watching his back. You had the high ground. The best shot in the company." He paused, letting the words sink in, twisting the knife deeper, they used to say. "You had a clean shot, Blackwood. I saw it. We all saw it. But you hesitated. Just for a second, and a second was all it took. Ethan could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, cold despite the warm sun. The memory was no longer a distant echo. It was happening all over again. The thin, cold mountain air, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the sight of Miller's lifeless eyes, staring up at a sky he would never see again. It was all there, vivid and suffocating. Maxwell's voice was the serpent in his own private Eden of misery, twisting his deepest regret into a weapon. The gnawing feeling of not belonging, of not being able to face his former comrades, intensified. His deep-seated regret of not being man enough to make the tough call back then crippled him, but his current deep-seated regret of the choices he made as a soldier was even worse. He was caught between his past self and his present self, both of whom he now loathed. "She's just another stray, Blackwood," Maxwell said, his voice shifting, becoming pragmatic, a cold, calculating tone. "A savage. She's not worth it. She's not worth another ghost at your table." He leaned forward, the mask of civility dropping, revealing the raw, ugly thing beneath. "Give her up. No one has to know you helped her. I'll make sure of it. We can forget this whole thing. Don't make the same mistake twice. Don't let another one die because you couldn't act." It was a masterfully cruel attack, aimed not at his body, but at his soul. Maxwell was offering Ethan a path to redemption, a chance to finally silence the screams of Wolf Pass by committing a fresh betrayal. Give up the girl, and the ghost of Private Miller might finally leave him in peace. The temptation was a vile, seductive thing, promising an end to his torment, a return to some semblance of the community he longed for. For a moment, Ethan felt his resolve crumble. What was this girl to him? A stranger, a complication, a danger that could get him killed, forever solidifying his exile from society. He could end it right now. One word, and the weight would be lifted. He could perhaps find his way back to some form of accepted existence. But then, through the warped glass of the cabin window, he saw a flicker of movement. It was Willow. She had heard Maxwell's arrival, had sensed the shift in the air, and was standing just inside the doorway, hidden in the shadows. She was clutching the deerskin pouch to her chest, her knuckles as white as his own. Her eyes were fixed on him, not with fear, not with accusation, but with a fierce, unwavering intensity, a silent belief. She had seen the man who had cleaned her wounds, the man who had given her his bed, the man who had understood her pain. She was trusting that man to reappear, and in that instant, the shame Maxwell was trying to wield as a weapon transformed. It burned away the fear and the doubt and hardened into a cold, diamond-hard rage. Maxwell hadn't just insulted him. He had insulted the memory of Private Miller by using his death as a bargaining chip. He had defiled something sacred. He had tried to break a man who was already broken, but in doing so, he had forged something new. Ethan slowly, deliberately, set the bridle down on the porch railing, his movements heavy with a new-found purpose. He raised his head and looked directly into Captain Maxwell's cold gray eyes for the first time. The man he had been, the hesitant, haunted man, was gone. "I don't know who you're talking about," Ethan said, his voice perfectly steady, devoid of all emotion, a chillingly calm sound that carried surprising authority. "There's no one here," he paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Just me and my ghosts." The words hung in the air. It wasn't just a denial. It was a declaration of war. He had not only refused to bow to Maxwell, he had refused finally to bow to his own past, to the weight of his own guilt, to the judgment of the very society that had shaped him. The line had been drawn, not in the dust of the yard, but in the landscape of his own soul, and he had chosen his side, his own path, outside the boundaries of communal acceptance, but within the bounds of his awakened conscience. Maxwell's threat, raw and final, hung in the smoke-laden air of the splintered cabin. His pistol, a cold extension of his malice, leveled at Ethan's chest. Yet, in that charged moment, Maxwell revealed his fatal flaw: underestimation. This wasn't merely a cabin. It was Ethan's domain, a landscape of intimate knowledge, ready to be wielded as a weapon. Before Maxwell's brutal will could translate into lethal action, Ethan moved. Not with a soldier's lunge, but with the controlled precision of a man who understood leverage and distraction. He kicked the heavy wooden table, sending it crashing with a violent clatter. In the same fluid motion, he snatched the single-lit lantern, a beacon of their desperate privacy, and hurled it towards the far wall. It shattered, lamp oil igniting with a whoosh, plunging the room into a chaotic dance of roaring flame and disorienting shadow. The soldiers, momentarily blinded by the sudden inferno, hesitated. That hesitation was the only gift Ethan could offer them. From the newfound darkness, his rifle, snatched from its familiar mounts above the fireplace, cracked. He didn't aim to kill. Instead, his shot was precise, shattering the second lantern by the doorway and plunging the yard outside into near-total blackness, illuminated only by the angry dancing flames within the cabin. Panic erupted. The soldiers, expecting a cornered, broken old man, found themselves battling phantoms in a burning room. "Surround the cabin!" Maxwell roared, his voice thick with fury, attempting to impose order on the chaos. His men scrambled back through the broken doorway, their military training kicking in, moving to flank. But they stepped from one trap into another. As the first soldier rushed around the side, a sharp metallic snap echoed, followed by a piercing scream. One of Ethan's old, forgotten bear traps, still brutally functional, had found new prey. A second soldier, moving clumsily in the darkness, tripped on a thin wire Ethan had strung that very afternoon, falling hard, his rifle clattering uselessly. This was no mere gunfight. This was a hunt, and the roles had brutally reversed. Ethan commanded the cabin, firing sporadically from different windows, never staying in one place for more than a second, a phantom in the smoke and shadows. He was no longer a soldier bound by rules. He was a ghost of vengeance, using his intimate knowledge of every creak and shadow to create the illusion of multiple adversaries, sowing confusion and terror among Maxwell's bewildered troops. While Ethan sowed chaos, Willow moved with the instinctive grace of a creature born to the wild. She slipped out a back window, melting into the deeper darkness she knew so well. She was not a warrior of guns, but a spirit of the land, silent and swift. Moving in a wide, circling arc behind the disorganized soldiers, she became a disembodied presence. A well-aimed thrown rock sent a soldier spinning to face a threat that wasn't there. A low, haunting whistle from the opposite direction drew another's attention, pulling them further into disarray. She was a phantom, turning their numbers against them, making them jump at shadows, doubt their senses. They were fighting two wars, one against Ethan's rifle, and another against her unnerving, invisible presence. Maxwell watched his control slip, his men dissolving into a frightened mob. Rage consumed him. He spotted a flicker of movement. Willow, silhouetted against the moonlit rocks, the faint glint of her deerskin pouch visible. "She's getting away," he bellowed, abandoning all pretense of command, plunging into the darkness after her, pistol ready, mind clouded by singular focus. Ethan, seeing Maxwell take the bait from the cabin window, knew this was the moment. He slipped out the back, leaving the burning cabin behind, a symbol of his past finally consumed by fire, and followed, keeping to the shadows, rifle low. Willow, a masterful guide, led Maxwell on a desperate, winding chase deep into the labyrinth of canyons. She stumbled, almost fell, always staying just within his sight, a perfect lure. Maxwell, lungs burning, didn't notice the canyon walls closing in, the path narrowing, the rock faces steepening. He saw only Willow, the prize. He finally cornered her at the back of a narrow box canyon, a sheer, impassable wall blocking escape. Nowhere left to run, savage, he panted, raising his pistol for the final shot. Willow simply looked up. Maxwell followed her gaze. High above, on the canyon rim, Ethan stood silhouetted against the starry sky, next to a large, precariously balanced pile of rocks in deadfall, the final piece of his trap. Ethan met Maxwell's disbelieving eyes, gave a slight nod, then, with a grunt, pushed. It began with tumbling stones, escalating into a thunderous roar. A river of rock and splintered wood poured down, not on Maxwell, but in front of him, sealing the narrow canyon entrance he had so eagerly entered. The final boulder settled with a deep, echoing boom. Silence. The battle was over. It had not been won with a heroic gunshot, but with the quiet wisdom of the land, with meticulous planning, a forgotten bear trap, a length of wire, and a profound knowledge of stone and shadow. It was won by a perfect, unspoken partnership. Maxwell was not dead. He was defeated, trapped, a prisoner of the very earth he sought to conquer. The hunter had become the prey. Next, canyon rim, dawn. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft rose. The air was cool and clean, purified by the night's violence. Ethan and Willow stood on the canyon rim, silent, looking down into the makeshift prison. Below, Maxwell, a tiny, insignificant figure, paced like a caged animal. His enraged shouts had faded into a hoarse, defeated silence. His surviving men had fled, scattered and broken. They would leave him there. Someone would find him eventually. His power was broken, his reign of terror over. They walked back to the ranch in silence. The first rays of sun touched the cabin, revealing its battle scars, a splintered door, a soot, blackened roof corner, bullet holes pockmarking the walls. It was damaged, broken, a testament to the night's fury. But Ethan felt no loss. For 8 years, this cabin had been his tomb, a monument to his guilt. Now it was just a building. The prison hadn't been the place. It had been the state of his own soul, the invisible walls of self-reproach. Last night, those walls had finally crumbled, shattered by an act of deliberate defiance and redemption. The shame of his past still lingered, but it no longer defined him. Ethan's cabin. Continuous. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and spent gunpowder. Willow moved to the center of the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She knelt, retrieved the deerskin pouch from where it had fallen. Holding it, her fingers tracing its worn surface, she looked at Ethan. With quiet reverence, she loosened the drawstring, taking out the precious kernels of corn, setting them carefully on the table. Then, she pulled out a second piece of deerskin, tanned, thin, soft, folded into a map. Not a white surveyor's map, but a map of the earth itself, drawn with charcoal and berry juice, imbued with spiritual understanding. It showed rivers as winding blue lines, mountains as jagged peaks, forests as clusters of green, a map of a journey. This, Willow said, her voice soft in the morning quiet, is not a map to hide. It is a map to build. She traced a long, winding path that led north, far beyond the oppressive borders, into a land rumored to still be free. My people are scattered, she explained, tinged with sadness but fierce hope, like seeds in the wind. This is the place, a valley of green grass and clean water, the place to bring the people together, to plant a new beginning. She looked down at the kernels, their vibrant colors, a promise of life. These seeds, they are for that ground. Ethan stared at the map. The last pieces of his old life fell away. He understood everything now. Her defiance, her strength, her desperate protection of the pouch. She wasn't just fleeing a massacre. She was on a sacred mission, a harbinger of hope, carrying the blueprint for her people's survival. He looked around the ruined cabin. He knew he couldn't stay. Maxwell would talk. The army would come. His hard-won peace was gone. But as he looked at Willow, at the map, he realized he didn't want that old peace anymore. The silence he had craved felt empty. The solitude, a cage. The man who had hidden for 8 years had died last night in the fire and fury. He had found a new purpose, a new way to belong. That's a long trail, Ethan said, voice rough. A dangerous trail for one person. A small, genuine smile touched Willow's lips for the first time, transforming her face, chasing away the shadows. I am not one person, she said simply, her dark eyes meeting his. The unspoken bargain, the desperate pact, had changed. It was no longer a lie for survival. It had been consecrated by shared danger, mutual trust, and profound redemption. It had become a new truth, a partnership forged in fire and hope. He gave a slow nod of understanding. He moved about the cabin, not with a hermit's weary shuffle, but with the quiet purpose of a man preparing for a journey. He gathered what was useful: a sturdy blanket, jerky, his rifle, ammunition. He left the ghosts behind, the hesitant man, the self-reproach, the yearning for a community that would never accept him. He was packing for a new life. An hour later, they rode out, not looking back. The sun climbed, bathing the valley in golden light, a promise of a new dawn. Their journey was no longer a flight from the past, but a ride toward a future for her people, built on green ground to the north, and for him, found not in solitude, but on the trail, at the side of a woman who had taught him that the deepest wounds heal by fighting for something more than oneself, by choosing to belong to a purpose greater than personal comfort. He didn't know where the trail would end, but for the first time in 8 years, he was not afraid of the road ahead. He was finally riding free.